I'm happy when our literature is put under the microscope, so to speak. Sometimes we need some help, guidance, getting into a particular text. And there's not very much work being done on Guyanese literature. So I'm happy that you're here. Um, Before I ask that question, your interest in Guyanese literature and your direction of your research, I just want to make a note of some of the scholarship being done on Guyanese literature with reference to one, Martin Carter, Gemma Robinson, an awesome study in Martin Carter. Then Juanita Cox, Edgar Mittelholzer, wonderful, wonderful work that she's done. And a lesser known study by Amina Ghafoor on Raw Heat. And Raw Heat is a magnificent writer also. Right. So I'm happy when scholarship is done on our literature. We have the text and we have a little bit of critical appreciation. Which brings me to you. What's your interest in Guyanese literature and what exactly are you looking for? What led you down this path?
Well, I mean, I grew up in the UK. My father is Guyanese, my mother is English. And so I grew up with my father's stories of growing up in Guyana. So he left in 1960 and he would tell us about, the things like going out picking a mango off the tree or, cycling to Queen's College with his books behind his back, things like that. So I was kind of accustomed to hearing stories of Guyana, but I didn't have my own personal connection. Like we never visited until, I did as an adult, but not as a child. And I think it was when I was at university, I was lucky enough to have a module in Caribbean literature. So this was at the University of Birmingham in the UK. And you probably know Stuart Brown? So he was the teacher
Who
for that
also
module.
did something on Martin Carter.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was where I encountered Martin Carter, actually. And an essay I did, which was probably the highlight of my degree, was reading Martin Carter's poetry and kind of noticing the shifts between this kind of political poems of resistance, and then kind of his later works where it's kind of more cosmic, kind of abstract, and it's a kind of a shift in tone, I guess.
Which isn't bad, that you can see the growth of a writer.
Yes, exactly, yeah. But it's interesting to connect that to the history of Guyana.
Yeah.
And I think that was my first kind of really personal connection to Guyana. And then, I came to visit one time, and then in 2016, I came here with the idea of doing an oral history project. And it didn't really work out because I took on too much. I was like, yes, I'm going to do 50 interviews for the 50th anniversary. And I just got a bit overwhelmed, to be honest. But I ended up staying here for like 3.5 years. And that was really when I built my own real connection to Guyana and to Guyanese literature. So to be honest, that and my own personal experiences as a mixed person has kind of led me to my current area of PhD research, which is looking at mixed identity in Guyanese literature. So quite contemporary Guyanese literature. I'm looking at sort of post-independence. I sort of taking that period just to narrow the field and also look sort of after Mittelholzer, actually. So you mentioned Juanita Cox, who's done fantastic work on Mittelholzer. So I'm kind of, I guess, continuing that work, but looking at how later writers have kind of spoken about mixedness.
When we talk about post-colonial literature, what is it we're looking at?
It's a complicated phrase. The infrastructure, the colonial hierarchies to do with race and class were still very much established. And we're still, trying to deal with the repercussions of that today. So I'm just using it a little bit arbitrarily, maybe, as like a point from which to kind of continue discussions. And also because I think it's uniting with this idea of creating the Guyanese story and building a narrative. Somebody used the other day the Guyanization, which kind of occurred around that period. And so I'm kind of looking at how literature played a part in that and in shaping people's individual identities, but also kind of the nation, I guess.
That word was around quite a while. Variation of that word was around quite a while.
Yeah.
I remember some of the older Indian writers talking about that. Even in that essay that was delivered at Town Hall in 1895, I think it was, by Joseph Rahoman,
Okay.
where we talk about one Guyana or Guyanese.
Yeah,
Guyanese
it's kind of fascinating
It's been
how long it's
around.
been around. Yes.
Yeah.
And I was watching a YouTube video the other day from Moray House, and they had the VC of UG, Dr. Paloma Mohammed, talking about the Creole publication, which I think was first published in 1845.
Oh yes, yes,
or
yes. She
something.
did research on that.
And
right.
you know, and she was talking about how kind of current it felt, how, you know, that these discussions around race, identity, belonging were happening right there immediately after the emancipation of slavery. So looking at the history is really important to kind of what I'm doing. I'm not just like starting my research in 1966 and ignoring what happened before. It's very relevant to what I'm looking
Of
at.
course, you can't study in a vacuum, sort of. Right?
Yes, yeah, you have to contextualize the literature, especially as they may be published after 1966, but written, the period in which they're set is beforehand. So, you know, Janice Shineborn or Unya Kempadu looking at 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Johnny Shineborn, another good example of,
Yes.
you know what I mean, Chinese Indian
Yeah.
mix.
And this is it. And a lot of people don't recognize that. They will say, you know, she's a Chinese Guyanese writer or something. And I read an interview in which she says, you know, people would ask her, why don't you write about Chinese characters? Not acknowledging her mix, so, you know, her Indian Guyanese mix. And also the environment in which she grew up, which was, I think, was around many Indo-Guyanese people. And she had this emotional connection to that sort of village life. So I think when you look at somebody, you can't tell their story, you can't tell their mixed background, you can't tell what cultures they're familiar with, things like that. So I think we lose a lot just by reading people from what we see.
What about all the Harrises, starting from then what's his,
Wilson Harris.
Wilson Harris.
Yes,
and
the
all
very
that.
complex
Right, very
world
complex.
Of Wilson Harris.
Right.
Yes.
You had to examine his work.
Yeah, I plan to. I haven't done too much as yet, but I'm aware that, you know, he like other writers is kind of drawing on different cultures. You know, he's looking at kind of Amerindian mythology and, you know, Guyanese and Colombian. You know, there's a mixture of. He's not constrained by kind of borders or ideas of ethnicity, and I think he was of mixed heritage himself.
Yes, he was.
And so I guess I'm most interested in like how land informed his work. You know, the different. He was a surveyor, I think,
Yes.
in the interior,
Yes.
and so, you know, these concepts of borders and. You know, he didn't. I guess he wasn't constrained by those, and was trying to break free of some
Right.
of these categorizations and
I
borders.
think so. And he talks a lot about cross-culturalism,
Yes. Yeah.
which is indeed a good way to perhaps delve or help you in what you're looking at.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Well, because it's a complex society, you know, because Guyana is often introduced as a land of six peoples. And as a few people have pointed out to me, you know, there's a seventh group as well. So the mixed group in Guyana is the third largest group according to the last census, something like 19.9%. And so how does that fit into the national narrative? So I guess, you know, in terms of what does mixed mean in Guyana, maybe there's different terminology.
What have you discovered so far that help you in your study or preparation for your PhD?
I don't know. I guess because it's something that I've been looking at for a long time myself. So as I mentioned, I'm a person
You're
of
just
mixed
accumulating,
heritage.
right?
Yeah, so I started off by looking, for my master's I did creative writing and education. So I created a group for writers of mixed heritage to come, share their experiences and write together. And, you know, there's often not spaces where mixed people come together and talk about their experiences. And even though we might have different mixtures, there's in Trinidad, there's lots of research on this area by Dr. Suan Barrett and Aliyah Rajik Singh, and they talk about a shared ontology, so a kind of shared way of being that connects mixed people in some way. You know, we often face different pressures to identify one way or the other, or, you know, you may get rejected by one side of your family or experience all these different issues.
It happens even in church. My children had to dabble with that, even in church.
There's an expectation that mixedness means racial harmony, and some people talk about that. You know, once there's more mixed people, it means that we're dealing with our racial issues, but not necessarily, because those still same ideas of racial stereotypes exist, and so a mixed person may be, you know, given both those racial stereotypes, and they say, this is your black side, this is your Indian side, or something like that, you know. And also, why I wanted to look at Guyana specifically, as well as my personal connection, is that in the UK, mixedness is spoken about as half, you know, and often you're half white and half something else. But here it's not necessarily about whiteness, you know. So how is mixedness experienced in different ways, you know? What are the privileges or prejudices received by different mixtures, African and Amerindian, Indian and African, and people who are a mixture, cook up, as some people say, of all of those things.
Tell me, cook up. That's Maggie described herself just like that. Maggie Harris.
Yes, and she wrote a great poem about, you know, the color of the color.
So it's about identity. But what have you found in your search so far, in the books, in the literature, in the writing?
I guess there's the different ways of approaching mixed identity. So, for example, in Tessa Mukwa's book,
In My Skin.
well, I'm kind of looking primarily at Shame on Me, which is her memoir, and her first novel, which is Out of My Skin. Yeah, exactly. And I guess, you know, some of it is kind of I guess a lot of the writers are trying to reroot themselves in this kind of mixed identity. So with Shame on Me, Tessa Mukwa begins with little sketches of all her different women in her ancestry. So, you know, there's a sketch of, well, not a physical sketch, but like a written sketch of her Amerindian grandmother or African grandmother, Scottish, you know. So she's kind of situating herself within this mixed ancestry. Same with Janice Shineborn. So one of her characters, and I imagine she draws on some of her experiences, is at school and gets kind of racialized as Chinese.
Yeah.
And she asserts, I'm Indian too.
And
so
then she came to
then
she came to Georgetown, and it's a different thing.
Yes. So also space where you are, the country and the town, and
defines, right?
Yeah. So within ourselves, like you said, you identified as Anglo-Indian at one point, and later you chose a different thing, you know, depending on the interactions you had or the reading you were doing.
Yeah.
So I think it's constantly shifting. You know, when I was younger, half-caste was the phrase that people used. And you know John Agard's poem Half-Caste, that's on the syllabus in the UK.
Beautiful, yes, amazing.
But then later it was mixed race, and you know, it's changing all the time, and I think that fluidity is okay. And you know, sometimes I think another aspect which I'm kind of uncovering is the need to look at gender. So there's sometimes a sort of a sexualization of mixed women in a particular way. And so it's kind of looking, I mean, there is of different racial groups in different ways, but I'm kind of looking at how gender, how class, how race, all of these things intersect. So I don't think you can just talk about race alone. I think you have to look at, and also land and geography and history, you know.
So many things.
Yes, so it's kind of like narrowing down the focus, I suppose.
There's a lot of writers with mixed ancestry.
Yes.
Guyanese.
Yeah.
Nalo Hopkinson comes to mind. Slade Hopkinson was her father, and you know, I'm thinking there's, oh lordy, there's a lot of material for you to work on, but then you're looking, well, you're selecting specific work.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and that's a complicated issue. So somebody asked me the other day, you know, if I'm looking at writers of mixed heritage, how am I choosing who is mixed? Because you can't tell by looking at somebody. And in Guyana, I noticed that the biographical information doesn't say Indo-Guyanese writer this, Afro-Guyanese writer that, whereas in the UK, we're very focused on that, you know. Writers are identified often in terms of their ethnicity or race. So how do I know? It's only through biographical information, maybe an interview or an article that they may mention their mixed heritage. But you don't really know.
That's true.
So that's a kind of something I have to look at. So at the moment, I'm just focusing on people who are talking about mixed heritage, or their characters are clearly mixed. So that's kind of the parameters at the moment.
There are a number of old heads who know the history, you know, I mean, one of the person used to get a lot of information from was Phyllis Carter. You know, she knew a lot of writers that came, well, to the home. Martin Carter and Gathering. And talking about that, Jan Carew and boy,
exactly, yeah.
Man, you can go on and on and on and on.
AJ Seymour and you know, Wilson Harris, Mark McWatt, Tessa McWatt. There's many different people because I think many Guyanese are kind of mixed in that way, whether they identify as mixed or not. So why I came to Guyana was to kind of find some more texts which are written about this topic.